Welcome to the history section. The metamorphosis of the samurai during the Tokugawa period is, well, it's one of the most profound and subtle sociological transformations in Japanese history.
It really is. We're looking at this evolution from the classic sword-wielding, land-attached warrior
Right.
into a decidedly more bureaucratic, urban-centered figure. Someone who carried a sword, yes, but more as a badge of office than a tool of war.
And this shift, it wasn't overnight. It was gradual, executed over decades, but ultimately it was remarkably successful. It fundamentally redefined the Japanese elite.
The key to understanding this transition is geography. It's all about where people lived.
Okay.
Once the Tokugawa shogunate established its control, the samurai class was intentionally moved. They were taken off the land and concentrated into these urban environments.
So the establishment of the castle town.
Exactly. The castle town and then the subsequent almost explosive growth of vital metropolitan centers like Osaka and, of course, Edo. This made the samurai, for all intents and purposes, an urban creature.
And they had no choice in the matter.
None. They were required to live in proximity to their daimyo, and the daimyo, in turn, was required to live in proximity to the shogun. It was a chain of command, a chain of residency.
So if we accept this premise, that the samurai was now defined by the city, we have to immediately confront the central paradox this created.
A huge contradiction.
Because the very philosophical foundation of the Tokugawa system wasn't built on cities, was it?
Not at all. The shogunate built its governing structure on an ideal rooted in antiquity. The philosophical framework was rigidly hierarchical, and it was based largely on idealized Confucian models.
Which prized agriculture above all else after the warrior.
Precisely. This framework stressed the inherent nobility of agriculture, placing the farmer second only to the samurai. The entire governing structure was supposed to be land-based. It was the land that affirmed the samurai's right to govern because they managed the production that sustained the state.
Yet, as you said, they were forced into cities. So this required urbanization meant the samurai class was living in a way that stood in direct contradiction to this cherished, land-based agrarian ideal.
And that tension immediately brings the chonin into the picture.
The merchant class.
The merchant class. The Tokugawa hierarchy placed the warrior, the samurai, the top, followed by the peasant, the farmer, then the artisan, and finally at the very lowest rung, the merchant, the chonin.
And the merchant was the archetypal town dweller, the personification of this new urban economy.
So you have this ideological foundation that requires the samurai to, frankly, scorn the merchant, juxtaposed against the daily reality of their lives.
Where they needed them.
Desperately. The urbanization process meant that the governing samurai class became financially dependent on the merchants, the very class they were philosophically required to disdain.
So it's this forced alliance. Strong, deeply interdependent, but also profoundly uneasy.
It created a constant friction that fundamentally altered the samurai's daily life, their function, and perhaps most importantly, their collective self-image. The urban reality was the necessary condition for this paradox.
So how did the regime actually make this happen? How did they ensure the samurai were removed from the land and contained within these new administrative centers?
The catalyst was a massive, large-scale castle-building campaign. It was initiated roughly between 1580 and 1610.
Okay, so right at the end of the Warring States period and the beginning of unification.
Exactly. Before this, Japan was dotted with countless smaller fortresses, which reflected that fragmented nature of feudal warfare. The new strategy dictated that a single, massive, centralized structure should replace these numerous strongholds within any given hand.
A mega castle.
A mega castle, yes. And they were strategically placed at key points, usually at the heart of the hand's communications and trade routes. They weren't just defensive positions anymore.
So the daimyo moves his entire administrative and military infrastructure into one central location. This castle complex, then, it becomes far more than just a defensive structure.
It becomes the physical embodiment of the new social order. In effect, every daimyo's capital was constructed as a scaled-down, localized model of the shogun's metropolis, Edo. It was about imposing uniformity and administrative control across the entire country.
And the architecture itself reflected this.
Oh, absolutely. The physical architecture rigidly enforced the four-class hierarchy, or at least the samurai hierarchy within it. Naturally, the daimyo himself and his immediate family resided within the central keep, the ultimate symbol of power.
And closest to him.
Allocated the prime real estate, so within the inner walls, and closest to the keep were the residences of the highest-ranking samurai retainers. It physically reflected their elevated status and their proximity to power.
And then as you moved outward, the ranks descended.
Precisely. Lower-ranking samurai occupied a concentric band further out. And you have to remember, the sheer volume of personnel required to staff this new administrative state guards, clerks, maintenance staff, it meant these areas were often incredibly densely populated.
And there was another feature, wasn't there? The temples and shrines?
Yes, interestingly, at the absolute extremities of the town, temples and shrines were strategically placed. While they obviously fulfilled their spiritual function, they were also structurally positioned to serve as an outer line of defense against any potential uprising or threat from outside the walls.
So the whole city was militarized, built for stability and control.
Every part of it.
However, this strict physical manifestation of status had one major undeniable anomaly, and that was the location of the merchant class.
Right.
The four-class system decreed that merchants, being the lowest class, should have resided on the very perimeter, maybe even outside the main gates, next to the farmers they were supposed to be serving.
But the research clearly shows the opposite. The merchants were strategically located inside the town, often nestled directly beneath the castle walls.
Which seems completely counterintuitive.
It does, but their proximity to the castle wasn't a philosophical choice. It was a visible spatial acknowledgement of the samurai's immediate, essential need for their services. Logistics, procurement, finance, all of it had to be immediately accessible. In this urban landscape, economic necessity always trumped philosophical disdain.
We can gauge the sheer scale of this necessity just by looking at the population demographic.
Yes, as these castle towns transitioned from being mere garrisons to comprehensive administrative, commercial, and consumer centers, the population ratio stabilized, and it was around an almost even split, roughly 50% samurai and 50% shonen.
And that shonen category includes merchants, artisans, and all the servants needed to support that administrative class.
Exactly. And in some domains, the concentration of samurai was even more extreme. It really reflects a heavy focus on centralized military and administrative function.
You're thinking of Sendai.
Sendai is a perfect example, the date Han. The samurai population there seldom fell below 70%. Even in census figures taken much later, in 1872, out of a population of 50,000, 29,000 were still registered as belonging to the samurai class. The logistical requirements for that are enormous.
That is a staggering figure, nearly 3 out of every 5 people being part of the ruling elite.
It is, and the most pronounced example comes from Kagoshima, the capital of the Shimazu daimyo in Satsuma province, an area historically known for its independent and martial spirit.
What were the numbers there?
In Kagoshima, the samurai constituted a massive 80% of the total population. These concentrations just demonstrate the commitment of the ruling class to containing their entire apparatus of power within these newly constructed urban fortresses.
And within this urban framework, there was a specific group of merchants who held a particularly powerful, privileged position, the Goyo Shonen.
The charter merchants, yes. They were often exempt from certain taxes and enjoyed the highest proximity to the castle.
What's fascinating is the background of many of these favored individuals. History tells us that a significant number were actually ex-samurai.
That's right. During the preceding eras of warfare, they had specialized in military logistics, equipment, and supply chains.
So when peace arrived, their logistical expertise didn't vanish.
It merely shifted. It went from supplying troops with arrows and gunpowder to supplying bureaucrats with money and consumer goods. They were essential tools for the new administrative centers, and in return, they received lavish patronage and crucial protection from the daimyo.
This centralization was also enforced by commercial policy, wasn't it?
It was. The Han government dictated that commerce across the domain was largely restricted to the central castle town. Villages in the countryside were explicitly confined solely to agriculture and handicrafts.
So you're artificially boosting the importance of the merchants inside the castle walls by eliminating any competition?
Exactly. You ensure that all necessary economic transactions flow exclusively through that designated urban center.
However, this early freedom and privileged position, it came at a price. As the Tokugawa system solidified, the merchants found their lives increasingly subject to intense bureaucratic supervision.
They were surrounded by petty restrictions, regulations governing the quality of their clothing, the type of housing they could occupy, even restrictions on something as trivial as carrying an umbrella. The castle town became a very carefully controlled environment.
That transition from valued guest to restricted subject must have been psychologically demanding.
I would imagine so. The security of living within the fortified town gradually morphed into the feeling of a regulated prison. Each city block, the mashi, was typically guarded and gated, controlling all movement.
And by 1649, the shogunate solidified its total control by making foreign trade a central shogunal monopoly.
Which closed the last loophole for any truly independent merchant activity.
Yet the fundamental truth remained. Despite their swords and their literacy, the samurai could not govern or even exist in the city without the merchants. The foundation of this dependency was financial, and it was rooted entirely in rice.
Rice was the bedrock of the entire economic system. The wealth of any han size, its administrative importance, was assessed based on its potential rice production, measured in koku.
And we should remember that one koku was defined as the amount of rice necessary to feed one man for 1 year. So it established this fixed, measurable value of the domain.
But here lies the critical financial flaw. Rice is a perishable commodity. It's susceptible to the inherent volatility of harvests, typhoons, floods.
And this volatility created the merchant's indispensable function.
They were the agents necessary to convert this unstable, perishable asset rice into stable, transferable currency money.
How did that process work on the individual level for the average samurai?
Well, their salary, their stipend, was paid in rice. This rice, collected from the fields, was generally stored in the daimyo's storehouses, often located in the distant capital of Edo. The stipend was then distributed 3 times a year, in the 2nd, 5th, and 10th months.
So it wasn't a steady income.
Not at all. It was paid out in fractions, a quarter, another quarter, and then a half. In the earliest days, a samurai might have personally collected his rice, a sort of physical connection to that agrarian ideal.
But that was quickly severed.
Very quickly. Gradually, this logistical duty was passed entirely to rice brokers, who were, naturally, merchants. They would either manage the delivery of the rice to the samurai city residents, or, far more commonly and profitably for them, they would pay the samurai the equivalent in coin and retain the rice themselves for bulk sale.
And this delegation, this was the point of no return.
Absolutely. Once the merchant was managing the samurai's asset conversion, the next logical step became unavoidable. The merchant began advancing loans to the samurai against the forthcoming rice stipend.
Because the samurai, always strapped for cash in this expensive urban environment, needed funds immediately.
And the merchant provided them. At a guaranteed profit, of course, using the samurai's future rice as collateral. This opened an immensely lucrative systemic avenue of profit for the entire merchant class.
This need for currency conversion was then magnified exponentially at the level of the daimyo.
Massively. You have the Senkin Kutai, the alternate attendant system, which required daimyo to maintain extravagant dual residences in their homeland and in Edo.
And they had to fund these massive, expensive processions between the two.
The sheer scale of these recurring expenses forced the Han economies to adopt the merchant system on a national level. A daimyo would maintain his own huge rice storehouses in centers like Edo or Osaka, ensuring that the harvested rice could be shipped directly there, ready for merchant buying.
Because he couldn't just haul tons of rice to Edo to pay for things.
He couldn't. He needed cash for city expenses and for his Senkin Kutai obligations. The merchant was the only entity capable of monetizing the rice on this scale.
The Osaka rice market, the Dojima rice market, it grew to a complexity that's, well, comparable to modern global commodity markets.
It's a fair comparison. Merchants didn't just buy existing rice. They advanced enormous loans to daimyo on rice that had not even been sown yet.
So they were essentially early risk analysts.
That's a great way to put it. They were calculating the financial risks associated with unpredictable weather patterns, like typhoons, and fluctuations in commodity pricing.
And this system, it offered a critical advantage to the daimyo because it spread out the domain's income, which was otherwise restricted to a single, high-risk annual harvest.
But for the merchants, it was a financial engine of compounding profits. It just consolidated their position as the true financial power brokers of Japan.
Further complicating the economy and benefiting the merchant was the unstable coinage system.
Yes, Japan used multiple currencies, gold, silver, and copper, and their exchange rates constantly fluctuated.
Since everyday retail transactions were conducted primarily in copper and larger trade relied on silver or gold, money changing became a highly profitable and essential business in every castle town.
These money changers were financial experts in every sense of the word. They were armed with ledgers and, crucially, the soroban, the Japanese abacus. And we aren't talking about some slow mechanical counting tool. A skilled operator could work the soroban with a speed and precision that would genuinely rival an electronic calculator today.
That mastery of calculation almost symbolized the power the merchants wielded over the fixed, rice-based world of the samurai.
It did, and Osaka and Edo rapidly solidified their positions as the financial arteries of the nation, linking individual Han economies into a unified national market. The trust placed in the merchants grew so profound that the supervision of the daimyo's warehouses in these major cities was often turned over to them entirely.
So in their capacity as financial agents, merchants were advancing money to daimyo equivalent to several years of their domain's rice production.
The resulting wealth accumulated by the leading commercial houses was truly staggering. By 1761, historical estimates suggest there were well over 200 commercial houses, each possessing capital exceeding the equivalent of 200,000 koku of rice.
To put that in context, that capital base was often greater than the assessed wealth, the koku rating, of many minor daimyo houses.
The economic tail was beginning to wag the political dog.
And the precariousness of this wealth and the samurai's inability to fully accept it is perfectly encapsulated by the famous case of Udoya Sabaroman.
Yes, in 1705, his property was confiscated by the shogunate. The official reason cited was the alleged total of his outstanding loans to daimyo. They said it was over 100 million ryo.
Now, 100 million ryo is widely acknowledged to be a massive exaggeration.
Oh, completely. It was likely several times the entire national income of Japan at the time. However, even if it was highly inflated, the figure serves as a clear historical marker. It underscores the immense, undeniable wealth the merchant class had accumulated, and at the same time the extreme instability of their position when faced with the philosophical disdain of the ruling class.
So the shogunate and the samurai class, unable to defeat the economic reality, they often resorted to punitive, arbitrary measures to fight back.
You see tactics like property confiscation, like what happened to Yodoya, alongside the repeated use of arbitrary debt-canceling decrees.
Where the shogun just legislates that debts owed by the samurai to merchants are null and void.
Exactly. And forced loans, which really amounted to state-sanctioned theft, were also commonplace.
And these actions were invariably legitimized by the official Confucian orthodoxy.
The rationale was simple. Merchants were inherently useless destroyers of grain who did nothing but absorb the samurai's rightful land-based stipend. This deeply conservative viewpoint was still being actively expressed by influential thinkers like Oju Osorai as late as 1727.
Which is a stance that was in complete, bewildering contradiction to the complex monetary economic reality that was sustaining the Tokugawa government.
Fortunately, later generations of writers began providing a more sensible analysis that challenged this official line. Dazai Shundai, who was actually a student of Oju Sorai, offered a pragmatic view.
What did he argue?
He argued that the acceptance of a money economy was simply a legitimate and necessary consequence of economic growth. It was an unavoidable extension, not some kind of moral failing.
But the most devastating observation came from Kaiho Seiryo, writing toward the end of the 18th century.
Yes, Kaiho Seiryo articulated the inescapable financial truth. A samurai who converted his rice stipend to coin at a profit was, in every practical sense, functionally identical to a merchant.
That single observation completely destabilizes 150 years of official philosophy.
It does. The government was trying to govern based on an agrarian system that its own centralizing, urbanizing economy had rendered utterly obsolete.
And Kaiho Seiryo went even further, didn't he?
He did. He noted that the profit a merchant made was, in effect, equivalent to a stipend, and was not materially different from a samurai's income, especially since the urban samurai performed administrative duties but did not work for their stipend in the sense of physical labor.
The comparison was existential. If the samurai's income was simply a stipend from converting volatile assets into cash, and the merchant's income was profit from converting volatile assets into cash, then the moral and social distinction collapses.
And the merchants, masters of their increasingly complex commercial world, held the financial power, reinforcing their position even as their physical freedoms were being curtailed.
The increasing wealth of the merchant class also provided them with something else, the means to influence culture.
Yes. While wealth was a potent attraction for cash-strapped samurai through debt and loans, the unique cultural institutions that sprang up around this new bourgeois class provided an even more powerful lure.
The Chonin culture,
Characterized by pleasure and extravagance, a direct reflection of their economic success. For the samurai, who were historically constrained to activities appropriate to their martial status, the ukiyo culture, the floating world of the major cities, represented a massive temptation.
A form of escapism that was formally prohibited to them, yet indulged in as often and as lavishly as possible.
The core of these urban pleasures often revolved around professional female entertainers, the geisha.
And the profession is frequently misunderstood in Western contexts, where they're often wrongly equated strictly with prostitution.
Yes, that's a common misconception. The geisha was, and fundamentally remains, a highly skilled companion trained rigorously in the arts of music, poetry, conversation, and refined etiquette.
The tradition was derived originally from the courtesans and dancers of aristocratic society.
It was. However, with the enormous growth of merchant wealth, particularly during the Genroku age from 1688 to 1705, the geisha's services became accessible to a much wider social class.
And this cultural flourishing, initially centered in Kyoto and Osaka, later saw its dominance shift to Edo.
Yes, during the Bunkabunsei period from 1804 to 1829, which fueled a massive explosion of popular taste and creativity.
Literature naturally flourished to serve this new market.
It did, and Ihara Saikaku is a perfect example. He lived from 1641 to 1693, and he was an Osaka merchant himself. He became one of the period's most successful popular writers.
His early success came from graphic novels about sex, which were quickly banned by the strict shogunate authorities.
They were. So Ihara then skillfully adapted. He shifted his focus to recounting the more officially acceptable lives of successful merchants, virtuous farmers, and loyal, if slightly tragic, samurai. He wrote what the new class wanted to read.
And visually, the defining art form of the ukiyo was the ukiyo-e, the famous woodblock prints.
It's important to note that in their contemporary context, these prints were generally regarded by the traditional elite as having very little artistic merit. Compared to the long tradition of restrained and subtle Japanese art, ukiyo-e were mass-produced, ephemeral, and often considered vulgar.
They were intended for simple illustrations, book covers, or playbills.
Exactly. Yet even this populist art form eventually had to accommodate the samurai image. Artists like Kuniyoshi specialized in depicting these brave and fierce heroes, often focusing on historical or legendary samurai figures.
And he often took liberties, such as dressing ancient heroes in the contemporary armor of his own time.
Yes, but his work was instrumental. Produced in large quantities, these prints spread a romanticized, simplified image of the samurai ethos among all classes. It helped maintain a mythical quality of the warrior, even as his actual function decayed.
But perhaps the most spectacular and least appropriate pleasure for the samurai was the kabuki theater.
Flamboyant, loud, unashamedly popular. Kabuki was constantly and generally ineffectively banned throughout the entire Tokugawa period because it posed a direct affront to the structured social order.
It faced two major hurdles within the orthodox Tokugawa stratification, right?
It did. Firstly, it was exclusively entertainment for the townspeople, the chonin, dealing with their real-world experiences and tastes. Secondly, the actors themselves were ranked at the absolute bottom of the social scale, just above the Eda, the outcast class.
A sharp contrast with the stately, highly restrained no theater, which was the only form deemed appropriate for the aristocracy and the samurai elite.
A world apart. The earliest years of kabuki, beginning around 1603, centered on actresses. They were wildly adored, and the dramas quickly led to significant social disturbances.
Accounts describe samurai rivals fighting openly, throwing away their inherited wealth, and neglecting their families in their intense competition for the affections of a popular actress.
This chaos led directly to regulatory action. A critical incident in 1628, involving a violent clash between samurai over an actress, resulted in the first of many bans on women performers. The ban was repeatedly enforced across the following decades: 1629, 1630, 1640, 1645, 1646, and 1647.
And following that final prohibition on women, the onagata, the male impersonators, rose to prominence.
They were already highly skilled, and the ban ensured they attracted a wealthy clientele prepared to lavish adoration upon the beautiful youths, mirroring the obsession previously directed at the actresses.
The government, especially under Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, became profoundly concerned with the influence of this theater.
They believed that women's kabuki had been banned because it disturbed the country. Youth's kabuki, in their view, posed an even more serious threat, not just to the morals of infatuated samurai, but to their morale and, critically, their fighting qualities.
They feared the elite would suffer deterioration due to idleness and pleasure.
So the authorities resorted to some rather bizarre attempts at social engineering to curb this influence. They ordered the compulsory shaving of the forelock for all onagata.
The logic being that by forcing their hairstyle to be identical to the fashionable half-shaved head of the standard samurai, It would make the actors less physically attractive.
and thus reduce their appeal to the samurai clientele. Compliance was rigorously enforced, requiring periodic checks to measure the forelock growth.
But the Anagata immediately and successfully circumvented this measure by simply wearing elaborate wigs when performing their women's parts.
This abuse of the regulation, which the shogunate seemed powerless to stop, it really highlights the inherent weakness of the government's control over urban culture.
It raises the question, if kabuki was so detrimental to public morality and samurai discipline, why did it persist? Why was it never banned definitively?
The prevailing theory suggests that kabuki was permitted because it was viewed as a necessary evil, much like state-sanctioned entertainment districts. From the perspective of official samurai chauvinism, the merchant classes were considered hopelessly corrupt and vulgar anyway.
So kabuki served a valuable function in keeping the chonin occupied, amused, and, critically, out of more serious anti-government mischief.
In the end, most ordinances targeting kabuki were passed less for public decency and more for the control and protection of the samurai elite themselves.
The urban environment, while providing these cultural lures, also bred significant disorder, often centered on the samurai class. Peace had rendered the warrior redundant, and redundancy led to boredom and resentment.
The most immediate problem was the population of Ronin masterless samurai, a crisis that reached its peak around 1651 following the conclusion of major civil wars. These were highly trained, unemployed professional killers, deeply resentful of the new peacetime status quo.
And this resentment manifested in organized resistance. The most notable example being the attempted coup in 1651, led by a Ronin and martial arts instructor named Yui Shosetsu.
His plot was audacious: to set fire to Edo, an easy task given the wooden construction, and seize the castle during the resulting confusion. The plot was betrayed, and Shosetsu committed harakiri. But the event demonstrated the constant threat posed by this dispossessed samurai element.
But the more common threat was simple street violence.
Yes. Drunk Ronin, or even respectable bored samurai, frequently attacked defenseless chonin. This was often rationalized by invoking the perceived right of a samurai, the Kirsut Gomen, to cut down any member of the lower classes who insulted them, regardless of the severity of the offense. The sheer potential for arbitrary violence was a constant shadow over the urban life of the commoner.
And even samurai of respectable rank contributed to this urban decay. Some Hatamoto, the shogun's own direct retainers, grew bored with the endless garrison life in Edo and formed organized criminal gangs.
These groups were known as the kabukomono, or eccentrics. They were easily recognizable by their long side whiskers, fanciful, brightly colored clothes that flaunted social norms, and their swaggering, strange behavior.
And they gave their gangs these outlandish and often pompous names, like the Daisho Jingigumi, the Band of All the Gods.
Their actions typically involved robbery and murder. It was behavior that directly contradicted the stoic, disciplined image of the warrior they were meant to embody.
Inevitably, the Chonin youths organized countergroups.
The Otoko-dat, or brave men. They were immortalized in kabuki and puppet dramas as noble commoners, street-level heroes who bravely outwitted the samurai.
Oh, in reality, they were likely just as disorderly as the gangs they opposed.
Probably. But the climate of the times was such that any townsman who successfully stood up to an arrogant, violence-prone samurai was instantly elevated to the status of a popular hero.
It's against this backdrop of bureaucratic boredom and arbitrary violence that the cult of the sword emerged.
It is. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the shogunate, was himself a practical warrior, yet he elevated the sword to an object of aesthetic and ritual focus, far beyond its functional capacity to kill. Swords were prized as gifts and were presented to him for his expert comments, reinforcing their value as cultural artifacts.
Ieyasu formalized this veneration. He compared the correct use of the sword in combat to the correct use of military power in his legacy.
Yes, he stated that the right use of a sword is that it should subdue the barbarians while lying gleaming in its scabbard. If it leaves its sheath, it cannot be said to be used rightly.
So it's a deterrent, a symbol of latent power rather than an active tool of war.
Exactly. But he also provided the classic, enduring illusion that solidified the sword's identity. The sword is the soul of the samurai. This concept established the weapon not just as property, but as an extension of the wielder's spiritual and moral identity.
And this philosophy immediately necessitated an elaborate, highly complex system of sword etiquette. In a peaceful society, the mere possibility of drawing a weapon had to be strictly controlled by ritual.
Touching another samurai's weapon, or even accidentally bumping into the scabbard, became a serious, often mortal offense, as it implied hostility or disrespect. The rules governed every interaction.
For instance, if a samurai was visiting a friend, leaving his sword outside was considered a breach of friendship, suggesting distrust.
But if he was required to wear it inside due to his high rank, an entirely new set of rules applied.
Samurai routinely wore two swords, the katana, the long fighting sword, and the shorter wakizashi, which was acceptable to wear indoors.
And if a katana was brought inside at the host's specific request, it was placed on a sword rack on the guest's right-hand side. The positioning was critical because it meant the sword could not be drawn quickly or easily with the dominant hand. It was only placed on the left side if an immediate armed threat was actively suspected.
Furthermore, to exhibit a naked blade was inherently insulting, suggesting a readiness to fight, unless the owner was a recognized connoisseur demonstrating a prized possession.
And even in that context, the ritual was exacting. The sword would be handed to the guest with its back toward him, and it would be withdrawn from the scabbard inch by inch, slowly, never fully unless the owner insisted. If it was fully drawn, the blade had to be held upward and away from all others present. These intricate rules ensured that in the absence of war, psychological warfare and honor were constantly maintained through rigid discipline.
This focus on aesthetics, ritual, and latent power provided the impetus for the systematic codification of the samurai's entire moral conduct, known as Bushido, the way of the warrior.
And although written codes can be traced back to the 16th century daimyo house codes, the first truly systematic philosophical exposition of Bushido came from Yamaga.
He lived from 1622 to 1685.
And he was motivated by a pragmatic concern, the existential deterioration of the samurai class in peacetime. He directly addressed the dilemma of purpose. Since the samurai no longer cultivated, manufactured, or traded, he argued that they couldn't exist without function. A man who satisfies his needs without performing any function is simply an idler.
Therefore, the samurai was compelled to devote his entire mind to the detailed examination of his calling. Yamaga concluded that the true business of the samurai was not fighting, but reflecting on his station, discharging loyal service to his master, deepening fidelity to friends, and devoting himself above all to duty.
The samurai's job was to be the moral compass of society. He extended this moral obligation to all classes, but he argued for the moral exclusivity of the samurai. Since the other classes, farmers, artisans, merchants, had no leisure from their daily occupations, they could not constantly act in accordance with these high moral obligations.
Only the samurai, freed from the necessity of work by their stipend, possessed the leisure to constantly uphold, study, and embody moral virtue, thus serving as the indispensable moral example for all classes below them.
Yamaga-Soko's approach was highly intellectual and ethical, but it lacked the raw, emotional, and practical guide that many bored urban samurai seemed to crave. This gap was filled by the great classic of Bushido, the Hagakure, or Hidden Behind Leaves, completed in 1716.
This text provided the definitive and often chilling definition of the warrior ethos.
The Hagakure was compiled by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, who had retired to a secluded hermitage after his lord's death, as Jonshi, following one's lord in death, had been outlawed by the shogunate. Unlike Yamaga's intellectual appeal, Hagakure appealed directly to the heart. Its opening declaration is famous. The way of the samurai is found in death.
The text continues by addressing the choice between life and death. If the choice is given between life and death, the samurai must choose death. There is no more meaning beyond this.
It frames continuing to live after missing an objective as cowardice, arguing that by consciously attempting day and night to think of death, one achieves true unity with Bushido. It's a radical, absolute commitment suitable for a class that needed to find purpose and peace.
The core practical principle derived from this commitment was giri,
meaning duty or obligation. In its narrowest sense, this was absolute loyalty to the Lord, culminating in the willingness to die in service. But more broadly, accepting the stipend committed the samurai to ultimate duty, a willingness to undergo any sacrifice to repay a kindness or honor a commitment. The ideal samurai had one word, meaning their pledge was unshakable.
And this commitment demanded that the samurai place himself firmly above all material reward, especially money, reinforcing the contempt they held for the merchant class.
The ideal was to maintain an unsullied reputation and martial prowess, even in administrative life. Yet the very expectation of upholding honor and clearing insults often led to deadly fights over trivial issues in the streets, an accidental clash of swords, a perceived slight in a society theoretically committed to peace.
Bushido writers were certainly aware of this inherent conflict between personal honor and the Lord's necessity.
Yes, they often qualify their exhortations, reminding the samurai that their life was fundamentally the personal property of their lord, and thus should not be wasted in a petty, self-serving quarrel. The very necessity of constantly writing and enforcing such a martial code for the bored bureaucrats of Tokugawa Japan is sometimes interpreted as a sign of failure, a desperate, written attempt to rally a demoralized and financially compromised elite.
The irony of this martial code in a non-martial era was not lost on the Chonin. Ihara Saikaku, the Osaka merchant and writer, brilliantly satirized Bushido in his 1688 work Bukeijin Monogatari.
Or Tales of Samurai Duty. He deliberately contrasted the calculated, profit-driven merchant with the supposedly selfless, duty-driven samurai, subtly suggesting that the samurai's self-sacrificing attitude was, in practice, merely a calculated path to achieving success and riches within the established system.
His purpose was to ridicule opportunistic behavior hidden behind a mask of honor. His most famous satire involves a young samurai too ill to fight during the Shimabara Rebellion.
His comrades mock him, suggesting he is only fit to chant to Buddha. The insulted samurai, receiving strength through prayer, decides his immediate giri is to avenge his honor. He kills all three of his comrades and then commits harakiri.
The disastrous outcome is clear. The Lord is deprived of 4 trained samurai for the coming decisive battle. The principle of duty itself is never questioned, only its application. It highlights the deep, sometimes fatal conflict between personal honor and the collective good of the domain.
And that question of duty versus law was violently removed from the abstract and brought into sharp focus by the incident of the 47 Ronin of Akko, an episode that shocked contemporary Japan and remains the ultimate measure of Bushido.
The incident centered on Asano Naganori, the daimyo of a 55,000 koku fief, and Kira Yoshinaka, the powerful master of ceremonies at the court of Shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi.
In 1700, Asano and Kira were commissioned to entertain imperial envoys at court, a highly sensitive and prestigious assignment. It was standard protocol for the junior colleague Asano to present Kira with customary gifts to receive instruction on court etiquette,
Asano failed to bring these expected gifts.
which led the deeply offended Kira to scorn and insult him publicly, likely over a period of days. The repeated humiliation finally led Asano to lose his temper. He drew his wakizashi, his shorter indoor sword, and wounded Kira on the forehead within the shogun's very presence.
Drawing a sword in Edo Castle, especially in the shogun's presence, was a capital offense.
The consequences were swift and final. Asano was ordered to commit harakiri, and his hand was immediately confiscated, rendering all his retainers, Ronin masterless samurai, instantaneously stripped of their income and status.
The chief retainer, Oishi Yoshio, who was notably a pupil of Yamagasoko, retired to Kyoto and began secretly plotting vengeance with 46 other loyal retainers.
Kira, anticipating revenge, dispatched spies to watch Oishi. To throw them off the scent, Oishi successfully maintained a convincing pretense for nearly 2 years of being a drunkard addicted only to pleasure and debauchery. This calculated deception successfully masked the depth of their commitment to their ultimate duty.
And that duty was fulfilled on a snowy night in December 1702. The 47 Ronin, wearing secretly manufactured armor, raided Kira's mansion. They found Kira hiding in a charcoal shed.
Oishi Yoshio beheaded him, fulfilling their loyalty, and then solemnly placed the head on Asano's tomb, marking their duty complete.
The 46 surviving Ronin immediately turned themselves in, knowing their actions had broken the law.
This placed the government under Shogun Tsunayoshi in an extraordinary administrative and moral quandary. They were forced to choose between 2 irreconcilable obligations: punishing murder by vendetta, thus upholding the central legal necessity of peacetime society,
Or rewarding the exemplary fulfillment of Bushido loyalty and duty above all, which was the philosophical bedrock of the ruling class itself.
The decision, after months of agonizing debate, was critical for the future of the nation. The government determined that the law had to be upheld to prevent setting a dangerous legal precedent for widespread vendetta killings across the country, which would inevitably destabilize the Tokugawa peace.
So the Ronin were ordered to commit harakiri, a fate they had been prepared for from the start, demonstrating their unflinching commitment to the way of the warrior. Despite the formal punishment, they instantly became national martyrs to the cause of pure Bushido.
Yet this classic tale of loyalty and vengeance has a lesser-known aspect that perfectly encapsulates the theme of this entire discussion: the necessary interplay between the sword and the abacus.
Okay.
Upon Asano Naganori's forced sentence, Oishi Yoshio did not immediately begin plotting revenge. His first action was to rush 400 miles back to Akko Castle, in an astonishing 5 days.
Why? What was the hurry?
The reason for this frantic race was not martial. It was financial duty. The Asano Han had issued currency notes, and Oishi, upon inspecting the treasury, discovered that the gold reserves only covered 60% of the note issue.
So he immediately had the notes converted at this lower rate.
He did. And this shrewd move achieved two things. First, it enabled the note holders, the merchants, and townspeople of Akko to recover some of their funds before the shogun's official confiscation order descended.
And second.
And simultaneously, it deprived the shogun of a sizable sum of money that would have been claimed as part of the confiscated assets.
So this action, a financial maneuver executed with military speed and efficiency, serves as the ultimate postscript.
It does. Even in the most celebrated and spiritually pure account of Bushido execution, a story of ultimate loyalty and self-sacrifice, the necessity of financial obligation and the cold calculation of the abacus were never far behind the gleam of the sword. The urban samurai, even in death, could not escape the economic reality created by the merchant class.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share it with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.